So
okay, so you know what I'm going to do? Today we're going to talk about results and what graphs and tables look like and all that. Before I do that, I'm going to rehash a couple of the slides from last class because I really sped over this and also Todd wasn't here, but this way I want to bring this up again because it's a really important issue that comes up. And that's why sample size, I keep bringing up sample size. When we clean data, when we look at get our data, at this stage in the analysis, why does sample size keep coming back to haunt us? And I just want to show you an example of how it can actually affect your results when you consider sample size. So this is an example, and I really sped over this last time, I apologize. The example here is when we were looking at an association between social engagement, so people's interactions with one another and their community, and cognitive outcomes. Okay, so in this case, picture the box on the left is the social contact. So this was the number of contacts, frequency, and number of contacts with other individuals, your friends, your family, your spouse. And then that's the exposure, and the outcome here is cognition. Okay, we looked at two measures, executive function and episodic memory. The analysis here was to look at those two, the exposure and the outcome, but also in a secondary aim to see if a measure that we created of biological risk, so it's a score of biological risk, it's called allostatic load, if that explains this association. So if that's part of the pathway, okay? So if the way social contact affect cognition is through this measure of biological risk, and the measure includes metabolic variables, metabolic measures, and cardiovascular measures, and inflammatory measures, and it's kind of this overall score, which I'm not going to get into. Okay, so how do you think you would do this? If you're picturing a model, how would your stepwise models look? Okay, so the first model, your outcome is cognition, right? Your exposure is social contacts. Okay, that's your predictor. What would you do to test whether allostatic load is on the pathway?
Would you run an interaction term?
So interaction is different than pathway, right? So we are gonna introduce this again in the next lecture. We want to distinguish between a confounder, so something you just want to control for, like age is often a confounder. In interaction, the pathway, which is it just part of the pathway? In interaction is different because interaction means based on differing levels of this risk score, this will look different. This association will look different. Mm-hmm. You allow this third factor to change. Okay, that's a whole different question. What we did was we had a first model where we had social contacts. The social contacts is the main exposure of interest. These items, age, gender, race, education, were our confounders. We just wanted to control for them. The last item was the score. And the score, you want to look at a model without your main kind of pathway you're testing and with it. Sometimes people refer to this as a mediator, okay? So we want to see now what would we expect if when we include this score, what would change? What regression coefficient am I interested in here?
Social context.
The social context, right?
So this is just a regression model.
It's a regression model. This is the difference between every additional contact and how it affects cognition. So for every additional contact that you have, your cognitive score goes up by 3 points, okay? And this is statistically significant. So that's what we expected. That's the direction we expect. If allostatic load is on the pathway, and I put it in the model, I expect this relationship to disappear or to go down. Okay, that would mean that most of this relationship is explained by my score.
I feel like this never happens that clean.
Okay, it doesn't happen. Well, look what happened. Look what happened, and I'll show you why this is model 3. First model, beautiful association, exactly in the direction we want. Second model, is it the direction that we want? Yeah, because it's positive. Much smaller, right? Really, like the effect size is much, much smaller, and then not significant at all. That would seem to indicate that, yeah, in fact, all this relationship operated through my allostatic load. Okay?
It almost says that preliminary hypothesis without this is non-existent, right? You had the line going from contacts
Yeah, but
to.
it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means that the way I explained it, this could still exist. This is just an explanation of how it works,
Okay.
right? So why would social contacts, why would my social interaction affect my cognition? Well, it might be that my interacting, now the causality is what we're going to talk about soon, right? Because disease might affect your social contacts and vice versa. But my stress levels are lower, I get more support, my biological risk looks better, right? My lifestyle factors are better, and that's how it affects cognition. So that's my hypothesis. The model looks great. Everything looks great. What's the problem here, though? My sample size dropped significantly in this model. Why do you think that happened? What's the one thing I changed in this model?
It's just whichever patients have those scores available.
Right, so allostatic load, it turns out in this analysis, this is MIDAS, only a subset of my population has biological data. So I went from 3,500 people to about 1,000 people because a whole bunch of people were missing biological data. Okay, why is that a problem? So let's see. I'm going to rerun. I want to make sure that the drop was not because of my sample size, okay? So whenever you do stepwise models, you want to rerun them on the same sample, okay? Because you don't want that drop to be because of, you don't want the change in the effect to be as a result of the drop in sample size. That's a purely statistical, effect. That's not a real biological effect, right?
Do you mean that it's actually due to a drop in sample size, or due to the
Yes.
fact that the population you're capturing is different?
So exactly. So it could be either one, right? We don't really know.
Right.
So it could be the same thing. It could be that this dropped, okay, so you have to know why your sample size dropped.
Right.
Is it a random thing that certain people didn't get their biology, right? Or is it not random? Now, it turns out it's random in the sense that all the 3,500 had the eligibility to return for the biology exam, but they chose not to because of whatever reason. Now, those reasons are not random, right? So it tends to be that sicker people or whatever don't go to this next more invasive.
Maybe it's just in this specific example, but if the change was due to a power issue,
Yes.
wouldn't you expect to see a similar trend, at least, as opposed to a complete
Good.
opposite?
So it is a similar. Okay, so good question. So let's look at what happened. So when I rerun this same model 1 in model 2, and I simply limited the sample to the people with allostatic load, I see a drop in. I see a magnitude very similar from the one with allostatic load. Okay, I see no difference between models 2 and models 3 with regard to social contacts. Okay, now my conclusion could be, now you're right that, now first of all, in terms of trend, if this was a negative trend, then you're right, something's super weird happening. But this is the same trend, it's positive trend, it's the direction we expect. It's just a much smaller magnitude. That could be the result of sample size. Most likely it's a combination of sample size and the type of people who are there. So it seems like in this sample, for whatever reason, social contacts is not associated with cognition. Okay, the conclusions that we came to when we looked at this is likely that there's much less variability here. So remember, in order to see an association, you need variability. So it could be that the people who had the wherewithal to come to this more invasive test, which was a lot more invasive, a lot more, they had to spend overnight, they had to travel by plane. They're already people that have considerable social contacts. They're not isolated people. So you don't have that variability.
Well, couldn't you test a hypothesis by choosing, how many 956 random people from Model 1 and see if you get the same as the self-selected 900?
In terms of social contacts? Yeah, so what you would do is you would compare, it doesn't even have to be a random, you could compare the excluded group, right?
Yeah.
And then you could see, So there are ways to test this, and in this case it was definitely a substantive difference, not just a sample size issue. But this, just totally changed our inference, right, into what we actually found. This problem comes up a lot, where you'll see it in papers actually, that in stepwise models, you just let the missing drop. It's usually not an egregious an issue as this happened to be, but it's really something, even if you have very good reason. So the problem is that, let's say you have 5 stepwise models, and you end up limiting it to that final model, right, that has all the variables in it. You're going to really limit your sample, and you may not want to do that. So you may want to limit based on what you consider your main model, okay? And then it's okay to kind of let people drop, because you don't want to throw away so much data, but you always should be running a sensitivity analysis with the same exact sample for the stepwise models. At least in a sensitivity analysis, if not your main analysis.
Is it typical to show all models in a paper? Because I feel like I don't always
do that.
See that.
You don't have to show all your iterations of your model.
Mm-hmm.
You should. I think you should show the models based on what makes sense in an a priori way. So if you have, and I would think about it in terms of the distinctions we made between confounders and pathway. And so, for example, a pathway, unless it's like your main question of interest, which was ours, you don't need to show your pathways, right? In fact, you probably shouldn't adjust for things in your pathway, because you're going to wipe away your association. So I wouldn't put pathway in the main model. I think of a main model with the basic confounders, because again, there's no reason to show a model without your confounders, okay? If you think age is a major confounder, I would never show a model without age, right? So show your main confounders. If you have a reason to like add, there should be reasons for the steps, is what I'm saying. Okay, so that I wanted to make sure to go over. Let us go to results now. Okay, so results. What do we include in our results section and why? So let's just review purpose of results. It's obviously communicating what you've done. It's also communicating what you planned to do. And I'm going to explain why the distinction here. You're doing both. You had a plan and you want to stick to what you initially planned, okay? If for some reason, for example, you decide never to show the results of a certain set of analyses, don't talk about it in your introduction or method section, right? Whatever you talk about in your method section has to show up somewhere in your results, and vice versa. If something is mentioned in your results, it should show up somewhere in your methods, okay? And I'll talk about the exceptions to that. But that's really important. And then the other part is you want to document what you did. Now, given to what you were saying, you don't need to say every single iteration of all the things you've ever thought of on this topic, right? You do want to be deliberate about basically this is what I plan to do and this is what I did, right? If there are forks in the road in terms of your research plan where you planned on doing it one way, but something made you veer another way, if that's a big enough change, you do want to document it. So let me explain what happened. And for example, one study we did, we didn't plan on doing it gender specific or stratifying by gender at all. We saw such vastly different patterns by gender that we ended up saying we have to present this by gender. And so we went ahead and sort of wrote up the paper in the sense of in exactly the way we were thinking. We're like, we blah, 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 introduction, background. And then in the results section, we said, given the vastly different associations by gender, analyses from here on in were stratified by gender. Okay, so that's a perfectly reasonable way to kind of document what you're doing. So you want, I think, generally, there's some reasons maybe not to do this, but you generally want to present things in a logical sequence that correspond to the way you presented them in the objectives. Okay, now this might be kind of a trivial thing, but if your aims are 1, 2, and 3, try to match up your results in the same order, 1, 2, and 3. It makes it much easier to read and to think about. Try to make your paper and your write-up as linear as possible. You want to present your main findings in the results. What I mean by that is you may have a whole bunch of sensitivity analyses, like the ones we talked about. Those all don't have to be in the results section. You can have a
sensitivity analysis section where you've, only in the text explain what you did. You may have appendices where you kind of give supplementary tables, but you for sure want your main findings written about in the results. And then, of course, we have tables and figures, which we'll talk about. When do you do tables? When do you do figures? When do you do both? And what goes into your tables and figures versus what goes in the text? Which is
It's one of my pet peeves.
Yes, right. And how do we decide what? And obviously, this is not, they're guidelines, but this is not, they're not hard and fast rules.
Do you find that it varies by discipline also?
It often varies by, yes, I would say to some extent it varies by discipline. The exposure that I have the most is to journals, to clinical journals versus epidemiologic journals. So I don't know about the dental world so much, but I would say in clinical journals there are much stricter limitations in terms of text, how many pages you're allowed, how many words you're allowed in a paper, right? I mean, that's how and then they want really concise language. I think people are generally looking at the numbers and looking at the tables and figures. In epidemiologic journals, there's a lot more leeway, depending on the journal.
Okay.
So, but they generally tend to be not so far off. In social sciences, like social science and medicine, they want a lot of wording. Where, like social science and medicine, I mean, you need practically a dissertation in your introduction. Like they want you to explain everything out. Whereas like Lancet, it's like a paragraph.
Yeah.
If you're lucky. Yeah. So it depends on that. So generally, in terms of text, you want to describe the main findings, but again, you have to be careful here because unless your readers, not your reviewers, your readers are really not going to sit and read through the results, like the text part of the results. Now, it doesn't mean you can't provide it. You have to provide it, but you want it to be a summary. And in many cases, you do want to list the numbers for, like, let's say your main hazard ratios. You are going to put in the numbers in your text, but you're not going to put in your numbers for all your covariance. You're not going to put in the numbers like you're going to give your main findings. So it'll probably be the hazard ratio and the confidence interval for your main findings.
And how do you deal with the issue of repeating, yourself?
Right.
Like you have your main finding, and usually, you want to mention that in a sentence, in the text, but it's also sitting on a table, next to it. So is it redundant?
So good. So we generally don't want to be redundant in information in the tables and the text, but your main findings, you will probably have some redundancy in that it for sure has to go into some type of table and figure, and it for sure has to show up at some point in the text. Now, when you already stated in your results, your main exposure, your main hazard ratio, whatever, in the discussion section, you shouldn't list that number again. Meaning in the discussion section, you could use words like, we found twice the risk, or greater risk, or because that's a more kind of thoughtful take-home thing. Okay, you're no longer talking about numbers, right? And take a look when you look through papers to kind of notice how they did it. The better journals will be more careful about, have like better worded papers. We don't want to repeat the data listed in the tables, right? You for sure don't want to repeat everything. And again, it's okay to repeat your main ones, but don't repeat everything in the table. And it depends. Sometimes your exposure, even your main exposure of interest, is a lot of numbers. And in that case, you probably won't want to put it in the text either. So you have to, it just depends what the exposure is. Keep in mind that the results section is a guide for the reader, okay? It's a guide, and if you keep that in mind when you're writing it, that's really helpful. Like, if I'm a reader, will this help me figure out what I did? Like, just think about it as someone who doesn't know anything about your study. Make sure your main points are mentioned, but that you're actually taking the reader, you're telling a story, okay? And it's the story of your study. so that's why the linearity of it helps, right? You want it to be logical. You don't want to start with the end of your study and go backwards. You want to start with what happened from the beginning to the end. And if there are changes to your plan, that's okay, but explain. Now, sometimes your changes, you don't need to let people know that you had changes to your plan. You just told them the end of the plan, right? In some cases, when the changes in the plan are crucial to explain because they kind of don't make sense in the context of your objective. Okay, so if your objective was X, your results should reflect that main objective. And if along the way, like the story of the stratified gender that I explained to you, you made a change in direction, that's okay. But we didn't want to start that paper by saying, we stratified by gender, blah, 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 because it didn't make sense unless we presented what our findings were, right? Okay, so I mentioned sensitivity analyses. And sometimes, aside from sometimes sensitivity analyses are not thought through in advance, and sometimes they are planned in advance. Like, we know we are going to be doing a whole set of sensitivity analyses because of X, Y, and Z. And you put that in the methods, and then you put that in a little section in the results, that's fine. In some cases, all these additional analyses that you didn't really plan on doing, you're going to include later on. You're going to decide at some point in your analysis process, what's my main analysis and how am I going to present that, and what's going to be considered my sensitivity analysis. So you may have additional analyses you don't mention in your introduction to methods, but you do mention later on in your discussion. Now that's slightly different. So for example, we did a study on looking at neighborhood measures and cardiovascular disease risk. In our discussion section, we bring up, we hadn't talked about this before, but we bring up a limitation that people may have moved. Okay, so we only assessed where they lived at one point in time. But in the discussion, we recognize one of our limitations are that people may have moved. In order to address that limitation, we did another quick analysis on the percent of people who moved and how they differed with regard to our outcome. That's nothing to do with our objective. That was sort of an additional thing to address our limitations. So it was perfectly reasonable to bring that up and do the whole thing and mention the whole thing only in the discussion section. Okay, so it depends how big an additional analysis it is and how relevant it is to the main objective. In this case, it only mattered for the limitation, right? It didn't affect our whole rest of our analysis. So this is just going to be arbitrary, kind of based on.
Wouldn't you want that in your results section? I mean, I feel like you would. I hate reading
It might
discussions
change things, right?
Where they like just throw new things in the discussion. I was like, well, where did this come
Right.
from?
So you're right. In this case, so few people moved that we made a decision to not go back and rehash our analyses. But you're right. If 50% of the people moved, that would warrant us going back and doing a set of sensitivity analyses on people who didn't move or stratifying by moving. We made a decision that it was good enough to just put in a little blurb about it, a one-sentence thing, because most of the people didn't move in the cohort. So you're totally right. It's in a case-by-case basis, and you might put it in one way, and the reviewer will say, "Wait a second, this is a big deal.
Exactly.
Redo it." So it's going to be up to your discretion.
Or you may just put it in the discussion to address the concern of one reviewer.
Right. A lot of times, it's not going to be crucial, but it's when I'm reading something and I can see that they have actually addressed what they could with the data they had, then that's a good enough thing for me. Like, I'll be like, okay, I know that they're aware of their limitations. If I know the data set, or I know that, wait a second, you could have really looked at this. Like, I know that you have that information, or I'm interested in knowing, do you have that information? Then I'll have them redo it.
And I think the other thing in the results that you typically want to include is if you're doing, like you sort of referenced this earlier, but if you're doing post hoc comparisons that or an exploratory, so it takes you down a road like you were saying before. So it doesn't necessarily have to just be sensitivity analyses, but it's an exploratory thing that maybe even you're just describing, but because you're pointing to what may be a future
right
analysis.
But I think a lot of red flags go up when you use the term exploratory.
No, agreed,
Yes.
agreed.
People do not like that, but it could be that that's what you did. So, for example, so in your case where you really don't know what the exposures might be, or it's kind of a really open book, then doing some sort of exploration is more palatable. But when I'm reading a paper, I want to know that they had a very strong a priori objective. I don't want to know all the possible thoughts that came into their head about this topic, right? This isn't right, so that's really important. You want to keep it tight.
Yeah, otherwise you're just fishing.
Right.
You're just throwing analyses at data.
Well, it also depends on, and I won't go on too much more, but it also depends on whether your findings are consistent with what you thought you would find.
Yeah.
Right. So if you find something different, then you may have to do some more post hoc or exploratory analyses to try to figure out why it didn't come out the way that you predicted it would. And that makes more sense. And you can do that more in some study designs than others. Clinical trials, you need to, walk through what was the plan of the trial and all that stuff. But there are occasions where yes, you say this is such a surprising finding that we
set out to exactly. That's perfect.
Okay, so what about tables and figures? So first of all, the type of table and figure should match the level of measurement. And we're going to see examples of that. And as we said before, they should not repeat the data. So for sure, tables and figures. So we talked about tables and figures versus text. What about tables versus figures? Do not just create a figure where you've already created the table with the same information just because you want a figure in there. So a figure should be adding something that the table doesn't have, and vice versa, okay? Sometimes, now this may be journal specific. So first of all, in terms of restrictions, some journals will only allow you to have 4 tables and figures. Generally, figures are nice, but I've written plenty of papers with no figures because figures don't tend to be as comprehensive as tables. And so if they're just pretty, like you just have to see what they're there for. Often they're very helpful. They're illustrations, which are easier for us to grasp. And so you may want a descriptive figure to just show the initial description. But don't just throw it in there because you need something to spruce up your paper and make it look pretty.
What about if in the table you just sort of are listing like raw data in a sense, like absolute numbers of patients who have property X, and then in the figure you're sort of like showing percentage or something like that?
So I wouldn't show a figure. First of all, I would very rarely just show raw data, meaning you usually want some sort of percentage, right? With ends in there somewhere. Your figure, if you have like a table 1 sort of, which is what you're describing, your figure should be maybe a bivariate analysis, like the descriptives by your main exposure or by your main outcome. It has to add another element that the table 1 doesn't have. You generally don't give descriptive figures, sure, unless it's like a histogram because it really shows you something really interesting that the table doesn't have, which I'll show you an example of that. Or for example, Kaplan-Meier curves, okay? Those are descriptive. Kaplan-Meier survival curves are not multivariate adjusted usually. So almost every survival analysis paper has Kaplan-Meier graphs in it because we kind of got used to seeing that sort of graph, right? So we'll look through examples. It's easier to see. But yeah, you generally you wouldn't want to do that in that case. Really importantly, tables should be self-explanatory. Most reviewers and readers go straight for the tables, okay? So even though you worked really hard on the other sections, the text sections, it's just what I tend to do when I'm reading a paper, not as a reviewer, but just as a reader. I will for sure look at the tables and figures. I'll maybe skim through the intro and I'll read the discussion because I want to see the takeaway message. I'll very rarely read through the results section because the results section is really kind of a recap in words of what's in the tables and figures. They should be self-explanatory in terms of literally, like you should read the table title and you should be able to know the data set that's used. You should know the years that are considered. The footnote should include all written out acronyms and abbreviations. Like the table should stand on their own. Label each row and column, include units of measurement, things that seem obvious, but, and this CDC website down below gives like guidelines for stuff like this, for the tables and figures, which are very useful. I'm not going to read through this, but footnotes are very important. Identify the missing. So in your tables, you usually want the N, right? You want the sample size. And if the sample size is very different from the way you described your analytic sample and your methods, you've got to do some explaining, okay? So why am I missing some people in the table that are not in your main analytic sample that you've described, right? And any other journal-specific guidelines. So make sure you check certain journals like specific units, certain journals like a way that you, some like p-values over confidence intervals, and you don't need both, for example. So you don't need confidence intervals and p-values. You may want confidence intervals and some sort of asterisk or footnote for what the p-values are. Okay, so commonly used tables is a table 1 is almost always there, which is descriptive. Table 2 usually can include, and this is, you don't need a table 2 and 3, but often 2, if there's a 2 and 3, the 2 will be kind of bivariate in the sense that, let's say your outcome is survival versus no survival. So you'll see all the characteristics that are in table 1 in table 2 by survival, right? So that's kind of a bivariate relationship. And then your table 3 will, and et cetera, will usually include the models, the multivariable adjusted models. You may want to include the additional tables for sensitivity analyses if you feel it's important. Again, usually you have a lot of limitations on the number of tables and figures that you present. Usually it's about 4. So you may want to not do this and you can always include supplementary materials and an appendix and that kind of thing.
Is table 2 sometimes referred to as a univariate analysis?
So that's semantics. Univariate is technically one variable. So univariate to be like exact would be table 1. Okay. Bivariate would be comparing a set of variables and another set, right? So that would be referred to as bivariate. But sometimes people just use the term univariate to refer to descriptive analyses.
Yeah, I feel like
it's not exact.
Okay.
Yeah. What were you saying?
I feel like sometimes it's like the table that precedes the multivariate analysis where they're just sort of looking at what the coefficient is for, say, diabetes.
Okay, so so that's a good point. For descriptive analyses, I would not provide coefficients. I think that's a waste when people do that, which is they do a crude model, which is the model that has nothing else in it but your one exposure. Again, I would never you don't need a descriptive table and background. A univariate model, right? So
that's how you built the multivariate.
Right, you could do that for yourself. That's not something I need to see as a reader.
Okay.
I am not interested in seeing any model where you didn't include your basic confounders.
Yeah. Okay.
Unless you think that they're potential confounders, you're not sure if they're confounders. But if age is a major confounder, don't show me something unadjusted for age, right? Mm-hmm. Show me the age range, but I don't really care about an association where you haven't adjusted for age.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So these are a set of tables from a very flawed paper that I had to review, that I didn't know. It was anonymous. I didn't know. I'll never know. I'm so happy that it came my way because it's a really great tool for my classes. And I have no idea who wrote it, so I can't. So this was a paper to look at, I believe it was hypertension control, so management of hypertension, and the outcome was, this will be useful in our figuring out. I don't even remember what the outcome was. Let's see. Well, let's look at what they showed us and let's see if we can figure out what it is. Okay, so again, like this is, okay, so the outcome was, okay, so it was Hispanic versus white differences in management of hypertension and healthcare access. Okay? What are some of the problems that you might see here? This is the table 1. First of all, let's look at the title.
The title.
So what's it missing? What are we missing?
What they're measuring.
Well, we may not need to know, we can say characteristics, but we don't know the data set. So this is NHANES. You should write NHANES somewhere in the title, right? Descriptive statistics of, you could say, commonly the select characteristics of NHANES cohort, blah, blah, blah. So no NHANES here. Turned out NHANES was in the footnote, but it doesn't matter. It really should be in the title. Other than that, I mean, it's a pretty wordy table, which okay. This was a study that set out to compare race ethnic groups, so this is perfectly reasonable. So if you set out to compare, let's say you are doing a study on, comparison by sex or comparison by race ethnicity, they very rightly so compared already from table 1 by their main kind of stratified variable. We never need to see, if your whole point is to compare race groups, we never need to see a pool table 1. Okay, so they were right in doing that. Okay, let's look at the next table they sent. So this is literally what the table looked like, okay? First of all, a terrible font, tiny. Forget the formatting for a second. What are some of the problems here? This is like an eye test. Squint.
Exactly.
What are some of the problems? Well, let's start with the title. What do we know from the title? Nothing. We don't know. What do you mean, racial health profiles? What is this? Are we looking at means? Are we looking at standard deviations? Are we odds ratio or mean? Why would there be an odds ratio or a mean? What's the outcome? Models? What's the data set? Nothing. We know nothing from the title, okay? We can't even figure out, okay, so let's say you think that maybe, so mean is not how you would describe coefficients of a linear regression model, but in fact they are mean differences. So let's say I'm going to infer that they mean these are the results of either a logistic regression model or a linear model. But what's what? Were these all put in the same model? I have no idea if I'm a reader, right? I can't go into their mind. I don't know what they did. What else?
They have, for any given value, they have actually 2 p-values. So they have like a row p-value and then an individual p-value denoted by the asterisk, but it's unclear to me. The row p-values I can understand. I think they're just comparing each against the reference, maybe, or
right.
Just that there's difference somewhere in the row.
Right. Or against the reference white seems to be the reference here.
But it's unclear if they're sort of testing each individual. It's confusing.
It's confusing. These are, I mean, who would present p-values like this? 0.00. 0.00 what? Like that's not, either it's less than 0.0001. This is just lazy. It's not informative. This is like a first basic draft of someone's, I mean, it's nowhere near a polished version for a paper. Another thing is, very rarely do you present odds ratios, I mean, in most journals, but I won't, without confidence intervals, right? So usually you do confidence intervals and like an asterisk or something for the p-value. Okay, what about this one? So this is their table 3, same paper. I told you this is useful.
They have confidence intervals.
No title.
No title. So again, we have no idea. They have confidence intervals now. It's, by the way, totally inconsistent with the last table, right? So you do want consistency.
I don't totally understand what their trend stuff is.
Right, so what is this trend? That's a huge question, right? Is it going this way? Is it trend across? What about their columns and their rows? So before, our columns were race ethnic groups. And now our columns are education level. Now, that's okay, but don't change your columns and rows for the same variables in the same paper, right? If you have reason to do it this way, then make sure your other tables look like that, right? This would be, by the way, more of a bivariate association, right? So predicted, I mean, this is just confusing because who knows what this is, but this is education level by race. That will be an example of like I think an in-between the table 1 and table 3. Okay, this is harder to figure out what's wrong. This is another study, and they looked at blood pressure. So they're explaining here. So what's nice here is that they say means, median, standard deviations, quartile cutoff values. You could just say frequency, like distribution or whatever. You don't need to put in all those words in the title. For markers of allostasis by each age group and overall allostatic load score in Polish men. So I have at least more information. The problem here that you're not going to know, because you didn't read the rest of the paper, is that nowhere in the paper do they talk about looking at the results by age group. Nowhere. And suddenly this table is by age group. Now, that could be very interesting. But if you think it's interesting, explain to me, as the reader, why you're putting it in there and put it in somewhere else, right? Do some other analyses that looks at it by these age groups. Okay, so there are a lot of interesting things that you can look at in your analyses and in your data sets. But when you write a paper, you're not spewing forth every single possible interesting thing. You have to tighten up and think about your objective and what meets your objective in your particular rendition of the story, right? In this particular paper. So these are just a set of a couple slides for your own kind of purposes as guidelines. This is a 2012 paper that I thought was nice. They created these tables on when to use text tables, when to use a summary finding, when to use a data table. I mean, some of this is intuitive, but it was kind of a nice, and you could refer to that paper if you want to kind of look at it further. Kind of a nice guideline. Okay, so let's move on to graphs. Just like tables, graphs have to stand alone. And in fact, to some extent, the criteria for this in journals tends to be stricter. So I think that has to do with how they format it and how they request it. So sometimes they'll request graphs as PDF files and they keep it separate from the rest of the manuscript. You really want to make sure that they stand alone, that the titles explain what data set they come from, what this is exactly. You want to identify your variables, just like in the tables. And yeah, because this is an illustration, right? So the picture means a lot in a graph. You don't want it to be too busy, too many lines, grids, that kind of thing. So you can read through this, but you want, just like in the table, you want to define your abbreviations, your symbols, and if there are missing numbers, you want to explain why they're missing. Scales, we'll look about what that looks like, why different scales matter. Okay, so let's just take a look at some different graphs. This is a graph of the distribution of LDL particle size, different phenotypes. Okay, so phenotype B and phenotype A. What would be your critique of this graph? So this is a line per person, by the way.
A lot of lines.
A lot of lines, right? Pretty unnecessary. This doesn't seem like the right kind of graph to use. What else would you do instead of this?
I think it's two different graphs, or it's two lines on the same graph. Is there?
So it's phenotype A and phenotype B, so you can make that into two different graphs. But you should probably use a scatter plot of some sort with a line, superimposed over that to create this line, right? So what you're interested in here is not this whole part, right? You're interested in this part. But you'd superimpose that over, let's say, a scatter plot, okay? Scatter plots are not usually useful. Descriptive graphs like this are not usually so useful. Sometimes they're useful if you really want to point out something interesting about the distribution, or a survival analysis like Kaplan-Meier graph. But in this case, you would not create a bar graph if your variable is a continuous measure. Okay, this is a case where you're not matching up your graph to what your variable is. Okay, so bar graphs are not usually used for continuous measures. Okay, so let's look at a number of different graphs that look at the same relationship. So in this case, this is systolic blood pressure by education levels, okay? So this is the first graph. This is a scatter plot. Okay, this is a scatter plot. I have education levels here. Education levels are actually 4 levels, and that's why you see the lines. So it's level 0, 1, 2, and 3. And this is systolic blood pressure. What do you guys think of this graph?
Do like a box plot.
Right, this is not, you do not do a scatter plot of a categorical variable and a continuous variable, because then it ends up looking like this, right? This is not interesting. You don't see the spread this way.
And their x-axis looks like it's a continuous variable.
Right.
Instead of, like there's halfway points
Exactly.
that don't exist.
This is not a continuous variable,
Right.
so you don't want to present it as such. Yeah. Okay, so how about these are your box plots? Does that look a little better? Right, so you see the distribution. You kind of see a trend. What does the trend look like?
Down.
Right, so you see with increasing education levels, and by the way, the first one is missing, that first box plot. There are really 4 education levels. Okay, what about a bar graph? Better, worse?
Maybe
eye exam, better or worse?
too simple, maybe. It looks to me like it overestimates the effect.
So you're saying the box plot, you see the spread a bit more.
Yeah.
You
There's
see
no
the
accounting
distribution.
for, and they shortened up the
Right.
y-axis to.
Right.
It's not untrue. It's just I feel like lay people could understand the left graph
Yes.
better,
And the outliers
Yeah.
show up in the top right. Right. But what about a table? This is a table.
I don't like it.
Same information, by the way. All this has the same information. Okay.
You're right about the box plots in terms of showing the most information, but in a pictorial way. If I were putting this in a paper, though, what would you do, Heather?
I'd go with the bar chart that's in
Yeah.
the lower left, but I would change the scale.
Right, and why would you change the scale?
Because it is over differentiating the groups. It doesn't go to 0, which is the valid
Right.
minimum of the scale.
Good. So we're going to see an example of looking at different scales. So I agree with Heather that I'd go with the bar graph for the purposes of a paper, and I'll tell you why. Like that, the box plot is crucial for your own knowledge of the data. You want to see the spread, you want to see the outliers. But when you're presenting, and that's very important for you to know. Just like, remember, we showed examples in the data cleaning, Y minimum and maximum. You want to know this. You want to do this. This is too much information for the descriptive measures for your paper. And here you have the same information in a box plot, which is nice, but this really simplifies it in a pictorial way. So it kind of depends. It depends on the rest of the paper, right? But just in terms of if you want to show the simple relationship, the bar graph is probably the most direct.
What do you guys think of violin plots?
That like a version of the box plot?
Yeah, it's kind of like a box plot. I've seen people be using more and more recently.
So what's the advantage over the box plot? Because they show their narrow.
They show like probability.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. So the truth is, you
I don't know
even
if it's
see.
a genetics thing.
Right.
I was going to say,
It might
I
be.
can understand why it would be important in genetics.
Is this what you're talking about, Aaron?
Yeah, it's like one of
I've
those.
never seen
I'll
that.
see.
Oh yeah, I've seen those. Right.
It's like a jitter.
Yeah.
Density.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a great example. I was going to ask you about that, Aaron. That I think that depending on the kinds of data that you have, the way that you reduce it to understand the things that you're interested in.
And that's where the field-specific stuff really comes into play. So there are in genetics papers, there are just like obvious graphs that you always include, right?
But I've only started to see them over the past couple of years that
So it's
people
probably new. Yeah.
Because-
seem to use them.
Right.
It was interesting you should say that because I went to a meeting and I saw all these really interesting graphs and I realized that they had just released a bunch of new things that you could do in PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So everybody was like,
Just doing it.
let's use those instead. And so it's like, something came out or whatever that
Oh, that's what
new-
you're mentioning to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't remember what
The
it's
new
called.
software program is going to change this, right?
Exactly.
All right.
But exactly. So if there's something that looks better,
Mhm.
use it. You know.
It depends what system you're using also. So certain software programs like SAS It's very bad in graphics. Stata has much better graphics. So when I've used SAS and kind of created graphics, especially for the descriptive stuff, I'll go to PowerPoint and it's not robust enough. So, you know, you want to, I mean, that becomes more and more important. For the work that I do, graphs are not that important. But yes, for some of the clinical work, and if you have scans, for sure, I mean, graphs become crucial. Okay, so this is an example of the scale issue that Heather was talking about. So these are, the y-axis is odds ratio. The outcome here is not screening for high cholesterol by education levels. And the different shades, the different patterns of the bars indicate different race ethnic groups, although the gray bar is overall. So what are the trends you see by education level? With increasing education level, we see a decreasing odds, right? So decreasing risk of not being screened for high cholesterol. What about within the education levels? Do you see race, ethnic differences? So this is the reference. So you're not going to see differences here. And the reference here is to white. So we see black and white differences, right? African American and white. We see Mexican American and white differences. But if we just take the scale and sort of exaggerate it for just the less than high school group, we've done a couple things. So first of all, we haven't utilized the entire scale of like possible results, as Heather was saying. And so this looks exaggerated. On the other hand, the differences might be lost here in this kind of other scale. So there are times where it is useful to magnify parts of a graph. What I think is really important is keeping the scale consistent across the different graphs in the paper. And this is usually not justifiable if you don't have the full set, right? So I wouldn't do this magnification unless there's really a reason to do it. And I wouldn't do it on its own without the parent graph. So it's generally not something you would do. You can also point out the differences, but it doesn't necessarily have to go in a graphical form. And by the way, the scale issue, if you really want to, the most egregious use of different scales is in the newspaper, right? So they do this all the time. Scales are always off and magnified depending on what the agenda is.
And I mean, I've certainly played with the scale plenty of times myself to try to make something look more interesting. But you just have to acknowledge it. So on your x-axis, on your y-axis, you just have to show the break. Right. You have to show it's a break. It's not the full axis. Right. Just like we all learned to do in elementary school, you know, where you had to show you broke and the zero is actually below.
Right, exactly. And actually, I'm going to show you in the next slide when you do actually want to magnify the scale.
On that one, I know it's not the point of what we're looking at, but I think there's something wrong with the graph because their overall, which I assume is only made up of white, African American, and Mexican American, is lower than if you average the three together.
Good, right. So there's actually another group other.
Okay.
But in this case, the odds ratio could be not just the average because there are other variables in the model that could make it a little different. Mm-hmm. So it's not just purely an average of the others. Okay. But yes, no, that's a good thing to point out. I mean, it's not really low. It's 2.5. With the decimal points, it's not really surprising. Yeah. But yeah, there is another group, although I don't remember if they were included
and
here.
Would a good metric for deciding when to, let's say, do the scale enhancement be if there was actually statistically viable differences between, like, I feel like this enhancement might be justified if you were showing graphically what is actually supported. And
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, and here what I would do to emphasize it is I would probably put like a little asterisk saying, you know, statistically significant.
Like with the little bar.
Yeah, and then in my results I would point it out, meaning there are other ways to emphasize it rather than creating a whole nother magnified sort of section. This is an example, actually. So here, these are the different waves of the MESA data, and these are predicted allostatic load measures. So that's the biological score I talked about. Okay, so lower score indicates healthier, right? So high score is a higher risk. And what we were looking at is changes in the projection across the waves by SES level. So the red indicated the lowest SES level, and then yellow is the next level, and green's the next level. So what we see here is that the steepest change across time, so getting worse across time, is for those in the lowest SES socioeconomic level, okay, which is what we expected. So you can't see this so well, but the red is steeper in terms of slope than the blue, okay? We had to look at it on a larger scale, because if we just included sort of all possible measures of all possible scores of allostatic load, this is what it looked like. This doesn't mean anything. This wouldn't have added anything to our graph. This wasn't the only information we had about this. So we also had a table that actually gave you the coefficients. But here we created the graph because we took the table, we took the coefficients, and we turned it into predicted probabilities, okay? And so the graph was showing predicted probabilities. Okay, so we felt like the graph added something, and we felt like we just wanted to magnify this, or else the steepness of the slope would be lost. Okay, so this is an example of how we felt like it was justified to magnify the graph and to reduce the scale. Okay, so let's look at another example of different graphs showing the same thing. This is a study that looked at pain so it was a Michigan Hand Outcomes Questionnaire. Patient reported pain scores for arthritis. Okay, so the mean score indicates pain levels, and we're looking at it by age groups. Okay, so I'm going to show you 3 different graphs. Well, let's start with this one. What do we think about this? So this is the different age groups. They're categorical age groups, and the pain scores in each. Average pain scores in each. Make sense? Okay. Do you see a problem?
I feel like I might be missing something. I don't see a problem.
Well, one problem is, what's the problem in connecting these dots?
They're groups.
Right, they're discrete age groups. And you sort of imply, even though you haven't stated it, but you're implying that this is continuous. You're implying that should you be in 39.5, you will be at some point in between, which is not a correct implication to make, or not. That's a guess, right? So line graphs we don't usually use unless it's a continuous measure, right? So so this is a bar graph of that, and then this is the other bar graph. What's the difference between the top right and the bottom, aside from color?
Bottom's a lot easier to.
Well, okay, right. So why is it easier to read?
The 3D.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no third.
3D is
measure.
fancy. You do not want 3D in your thing. 3D is really hard to read in graphs. First of all, it implies some other additional plane, right? But
Right,
you don't
there's
really
no
have
other-
another plane. This should be 2-dimensional. The other thing is notice the color. So this is important. A lot of journals, unless you pay extra, this is very nice that there are different colors here. First of all, here the shading is a little too similar, I think. And the 3D really messes you up, right? Because the top becomes like this one. But this color is nice when you're looking at it in color, but pay attention to what your journal is going to print it in, right? So oftentimes it's not color printing, it's black and white printing. So in the proofs, you may look at it and be like, wait a second, I have to go back and create some sort of pattern to distinguish between.
Isn't there also a push, if you do use color, to use a palette for colorblind?
Oh, interesting. Yeah?
Yeah,
The ADA.
that makes sense. Yeah.
I don't think
I've never used color
used
because I'm
color.
too cheap.
Yeah, why would I pay for color? I don't know.
But
I don't think
I
I've
don't
ever-
have cool, cool
Right.
slide, gels to show or anything.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. So
It's
there,
just
there,
stupid
there is
figures.
reason to use color.
One other thing I might say, the one time that I would want to use that line graph, and this is one of the rules that I use, is if that was actually a longitudinal study and you were showing pain over time
Yes.
for somebody, and so as they aged, what their pain was, because it's the same people. So you can't connect the dots if it's not the same people.
Right, so that's a good point. That's a distinction. So this is a cross-sectional study. But if you're looking at waves, so look at the previous one. That was also, right? So here I have waves. They're distinct time periods. People came at distinct times. But the reason I collected them is because the whole study was to do a trajectory analysis over time. Okay, so good. Thank you for pointing
Could
that
in
out, Heather.
theory, I guess, present the previous
The other
one
one,
as
yeah.
a bar graph, right?
Yeah.
I think it probably would be less visually effective.
Yes,
but you
because
could.
the study, the models we were doing were growth curve models that were showing over time. Like that was the point of it. So that's exactly the point. You want to connect your presentation as much as you can to what you actually did, to your model. Think about the point of what you're doing. Am I doing a trajectory analysis? Am I doing a longitudinal analysis? Am I showing cross-sectional? And really, if you think it through, the graphs will make a lot more sense. So this is another guideline, sort of a cheat sheet on, suggestions as when you should use one. It's the same study that we saw before. So when you should use what kind of graph, which is helpful just for ideas. So feel free to use that. And this is the continuation of it. So this is all in that 2012 paper. So consort diagrams for randomized clinical trials. This is something I will pass over to Heather because she's dealt with this more. Very, very common and useful. And I'll just say before Heather talks about these for a second, sometimes when you have a really complicated flow chart of your sample size, even if it's an observational study or a cohort study, whatever, these are really useful because you can really explain, like, people dropped out because of that, then we continued here. So it's not only used for RCTs, but it's almost, if they're, all RCTs use them, put it that way.
Right. Because it's the transparency issue for understanding the context. So are you familiar with consorts? Do they talk about them in your classes?
I don't think so. Have seen that.
Yeah. So you're just wanting to take them all the way through. You want to take everybody through the stages so they figure out where are people dropping out and where you might have your challenges to your generalizability. So all of this is going to tell you about how people came in. So how many were eligible, and then the degree to which you put the details about the exclusions, it would really be whether or not there were exclusions that were of particular interest to the field. So did you exclude for a particular medical condition? It may be important to show that because it could be that a bunch of people fell out at that point. So that you can show, and you always want to make sure that when you get to randomized, if you took eligibility minus all the exclusions, you would get randomized. Because you don't want to have any other missings, right?
Add up your ends.
Do your algebra. And then how did they get allocated to their different study arms? And you may have more than one, right? And make sure that you include the people who ended up not, maybe somebody got randomized and then dropped out, right? Because they made it through here, but they got to randomization. Like we did this yoga study, and we had more people in the controls drop out than the people in the intervention because the controls did the yoga classes for 6 months. So some people were like, forget it, I'm not doing your study. I wanted to do the yoga. So anyway, so you want to make sure that you represent that there. And then always, of course, lost to follow-up. Why are they lost to follow-up? That's an important piece. You need to be able to talk about what people couldn't get to wherever they were. And then we've talked a lot about your analysis sample versus your follow-up. So there's actually, like, you can go online and you can find stuff you can just, like, plug in, and it makes a consort diagram for you. But as Sharon said, I think we're seeing them more and more, even in not clinical trials, just these flow charts, because everybody wants to be sure who's included in the study.
So like it depends on my restrictions, but if I only have 4 tables and figures, I'm not going to waste, if it's not a randomized clinical trial where I really should be showing this, I'm not going to waste a figure on a flow chart, okay? I will explain that in the text. If it's a very complicated situation, you kind of have to justify this because you have manipulated these groups in a randomized control trial, okay? You haven't done as much manipulation in an observational study. That's why it's not as required. But you definitely want to know how you got from the full sample to your final sample. So you have to explain it somewhere. Okay, so when do we use tables versus graphs? We talked about this a little bit, but you want to ask yourself, what can this illustration give me and add in terms of conveying my results, telling this story? What can one give me versus the other? Okay, what can you show in the graph that's not clear in the table? So usually our table, or vice versa, but usually you need at least 1 or 2 tables. You don't necessarily need a graph. A graph is helpful, but a graph by nature, because it doesn't have all the numbers, will usually contain less information. Okay, so you do want to ask yourself, what is this graph adding? So I'm going to give you an example of when I actually used a table and a graph with the same information, but I felt like the graph really added, and I needed that table 1 in there, so I couldn't take away the table, right? So this is a study using NHANES data, looking at neighborhood socioeconomic status, and we were looking at this measure of biological risk called allostatic load. So the main point in the study was to compare race ethnic groups. Our main race ethnic groups were white, black, Mexican, American in NHANES. And we left out the other group. And these are the main characteristics. So look at my title of my table, right? The characteristics of the NHANES study sample by race ethnicity. So I'm giving the information, okay? These are some of my main variables. So age, gender, neighborhood socioeconomic status. This is the kind of a subtitle. The number of the neighborhood, so the number of census tracts I used, the number of participants per neighborhood, and then here I have my score. So this was my main thing. My main exposure of interest was this neighborhood socioeconomic score, and I split it up into quintiles. Okay, so these are approximately 20th percentile groups. Okay, and in parentheses here I give my range. Okay, so the range of this total score by overall, and then each of the race ethnic groups. Okay, so this is fine. All the information's here. If I really want to look very carefully, I could look at this information. I could see that it kind of looks like the whites are basically pretty equally distributed, pretty similar to the total sample because I have a big percentage of whites. But what happens with the African American sample? It looks very different from the white sample, right? Where do I have a bigger representation? So this is 56%. Where do 56% live?
First quintile.
In the lowest quintile. Okay, so this looks really different. And the Mexican American group looks pretty similar to the black group. Okay, so fine, I can figure that out. But if I actually, bless you, if I actually put it in a graph,
right,
you see it really differently.
yeah.
Right? So not only do a higher percentage of African Americans live in this lowest quintile, okay, but they almost don't overlap at all with the white group. Okay, so this pictorial like illustration tells a lot more in the graph than only in the table.
This is sort of what I was asking about earlier, because I sort of have a similar situation right now in the paper I'm working on where this is really sort of large, cumbersome table with like all.
Oh, so that's what you were saying. So putting in a graph,
to sort of summarize a lot of that so that they can visually. So for example, so the paper.
Because I thought you were making a distinction between raw values and like percentages.
Well, no, it's not. So the situation is it's genetic testing in all of these kids who have neurodevelopmental disorders.
Right.
And there was like a table with like all of the kids, which is like 35 kids.
Right.
And all of their sort of phenotypic demographic information. But the point that I want to get across is sort of what's the diagnostic yield? Like how good does the testing show a result across the different, if a kid has an autism diagnosis versus intellectual disability diagnosis, and all of those are listed. Each kid's diagnosis are listed.
Then
but to see like
overall,
the actual overall, like
I would
really
create
hard.
a graph and then compare and see if this is adding, if this is conveying what you want it to convey in a different way.
To me, it's much easier to see, like, okay, kids with autism have this yield idea, this yield, as opposed to like counting
all the different numbers.
Kids.
No, it sounds like there would be utility in that. Yeah. I thought you were talking about the different level of like measurement, but it sounds like there would be utility in.
Well, what I was talking about, so I convert it to percent, right? So 20% of kids with IED.
Right, but I'm saying you may want to but you may want to even convert it to percent in the table.
Right. Yeah,
right. That's what I'm saying. You probably want percent and ends in that table. But yeah, if you think the graph adds, like in this case, that was the whole point I wanted to bring out, that we have to look at it by race ethnic group because this is completely confounded by race. Place and race are completely confounded. So if you think there's reason to look at it pictorially, I would for sure.
Because I've been wondering, because I'm like, I am sort of, using the same data set in two different, I was like, is this kosher? Is this sort of redundant? But to me, it seems
let the reviewers decide that. Meaning, if you see that there is an advantage, put it in there. The worst case scenario is they say we don't need both of those, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. This is just, I wanted to show another graph of when things are rough and you don't know what to do because, okay, so here we have regression coefficients are on the y-axis. And I looked at a combination of adult education levels and parental education levels. So does someone have parents who had low education and they had low education? Parents who had low education, they had medium education. Parents who had low education, they had high, so it's a combination categories. There are 9 categories. And so there is another plane, okay? So there's reason to have a 3D graph. In fact, I couldn't figure out how to do this without a 3D graph, but I despise 3D graphs. And the shading is so annoying. And it's like, so I wanted to look at trends in this direction and in this direction, okay? But it was a little hard to do. So we didn't end up putting this in the paper and we kind of created a different thing. This is when you kind of have to play around with different software programs, think about different ways of doing this, different shading mechanisms, but like we struggled with this.
Well, people sometimes, I don't know if it would work for the specific situation, but I've seen people do like the point that they use has different sizes.
Right.
I don't know what that's called.
To show bigger. It's called something. It's interesting. We tried this in different ways and also like horizontally and not vertically, and it was not so easy. And that's the other thing. Like, I'm not a graphic designer. Like, I don't want to sit there spending all my time, So this is when like help. I just went to a statistician. I was like, it was a statistician. I was like, please find me a way to like do this better. And actually, she helped me a lot. And we didn't end up having room for this graph. So I ended up just explaining it in the text. But it's sometimes a struggle. It's not always easy. Okay, so you want to ask yourself what data should be in the table versus figure, but what data should be in the table figure versus the text, okay? And how should you decide this? Again, what I would say is that your main results you want to mention at some point in the text, even though not a lot of people will read them. They should be there somewhere, okay? But most of your numbers are going to be listed in tables and figures, okay? Because it's just not an easy way to read it. Some reminders: make sure your study objectives are met. Only present the data that's referenced in the paper. If I suddenly see a variable that I have never heard about before in the table or figure, I'm going to question that as a reader and for sure as a reviewer, right? So if you decided later on in your paper, it'd be really interesting to see what the BMI for these levels are, then that's interesting, but it has to be brought up somewhere in the paper. And usually you don't have room for sensitivity analyses unless you think it's really relevant to your findings. So I would put those in supplemental tables and figures.
Or you can mention it in the results section.
Right.
I've seen sources just like
Yes,
with the last line.
just
to,
list
like,
it,
the area under the
absolutely.
curve.
Yeah. So I would
Data
just
not shown.
right,
Or
data
yeah.
not shown.
My
No,
favorite thing to say.
Yeah. So that's actually interesting that you say the data not shown, because sometimes that's misused, right? So data not shown is okay if you have very good reasons. So if you compared the included and excluded group and you've summarized the comparison for me, and you've told me as the reader, like, our included group is a little, heavier, like more white people, more males. Okay, that's usually okay not to show. In some cases, if the differences are strong, then that's like an example of sometimes reviewers are like, we want to see that in your table 1. But that's pretty acceptable to just say data not shown. If you have some main results, it's not so acceptable not to show them anywhere. Right.
And is there any reason why not to just put it in a supplemental table?
So that's really journal specific.
Yeah, because a lot of journals won't let you put.
They won't have.
They limit what you're. I mean,
Right.
with electronic journals, it's
Right.
changing. But and when I use it mostly, it's when I've tested for something and it's not different.
Right.
So everybody knows I tested it and it's not different. And so just believe me, data not shown.
Right. When you have a whole array of sensitivity, like I redid all the analyses without this imputation method, just removing the missing values, just to kind of test, and results remained unchanged.
Right.
Data not shown. That's reasonable, right?
That's right.
Okay. The final thing is just we really encourage you to create table shells and figures, right? So your shells are really important. That skeleton, so you can think out, okay, where do I want to put my columns, my rows? It's helpful for you. It's helpful for an analyst if you have one. But I even like to do this at the stage while I'm doing the analysis, not at the very end, because it helps inform me as to how I'm going to proceed with the analysis. So that's it.
I have two more things. One, this is one of my pet peeves. Think about the precision with which you need to present your information. Lots of times you can simply round to a whole number in your discussion. You don't have to have 3 significant digits after the decimal point.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other, and I was actually guilty of this, we figured this out. The reviewers didn't catch it, but we called something in the paper for a while, we called it one thing, and then when we got to the table and the title, we called it something else. So maybe it's education in one place and it's high school graduate in another place. Anyway, if you're use the same nomenclature for your factors all the way through.
And try to use the same number of decimal points also.
Yes.
The paper.
Fair enough. Thank
Great.
you.
All right,
Okay,
thanks.
see you guys. So no class on Monday.